Hello. Hi, thanks to everyone for joining. And welcome to this webinar where we were launching the market-based programming and shelter guidance note. Now, before I say anything else, I just need to let you all know that this session is being automatically recorded. And I just want to mention, I know that we're all used to online calls by now, but also just a quick reminder to ensure you keep your microphones off and also your cameras off unless you're presenting or talking. So with that practical stuff out of the way, again, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us for this launch event. As you are probably aware, the Global Shelter Cluster, Shelter Cash and Markets Community of Practice and the Markets in Crisis Community of Practice recently worked together to produce this note as part of a collaborative and ongoing effort that we have to try and help improve understanding of market-based programming for shelter and housing markets. So we've got probably a really big mix of people joining us here today. So you might not be aware of both groups. So I might just give a quick overview of who we are. So next slide, Jenny. Thanks. So just a quick summary, the Shelter Cash and Markets COP grew out of the old Shelter and Cash Working Group in the Global Shelter Cluster. So it was established just in 2020, but it was a group of practitioners who were really keen to keep this conversation around cash and market-based programming in shelter going. We use this as a space to share and exchange and provide technical input around cash and markets in shelter. At the moment, we've been meeting quarterly and we have been trying to contribute to guidance like the one that we're launching here today. And yes, it's co-facilitated by the Australian Red Cross and Catholic Relief Services. The Markets in Crisis COP is a huge group of over 2,800 practitioners who are engaging with markets in emergency and recovery contexts, which is pretty amazing. And that membership is over 120 countries with lots of NGOs, multilateral agencies and academic institutions and the like. Again, it's another space to share ideas and experiences and resources with the aim of improving market-based programming in emergency recovery and development contexts. Now, obviously, given those overlapping interests of the two groups and the remit for them as well, we came together in 2021 to kind of investigate opportunities that we have for that we could see for developing learning materials together. And so this simple market-based programming and shelter guidance was the first identified piece that we agreed to collaborate on. So next slide, thanks. The objective of this webinar then today is to launch the guidance, as I've said, and raise some awareness around shelter and markets practitioners on its existence. The other one is to provide a bit of a basic understanding of what MBP and shelter is. And we've got some really great colleagues online who are going to share some practical examples of what that means. We're going to hopefully promote a bit of discussion and experience sharing. And obviously we want to also encourage more practitioners to engage in both the COPs who have come together to create this note. And so to do that, we've got this pretty simple agenda. We'll have a bit of a background and an overview of market-based programming in shelter, and then we'll share with those colleagues with the really great case studies. And then hopefully we're going to have a bunch of time to have discussion and questions from all of you. So before we launch into all of that, we just want to do some quick polls to understand who we've got with us on the call. So if we could just launch the first of those polls, please. Because we'd like to know, first of all, how would you describe your background? And hopefully you will be able to access the poll through the screen. You should be able to pick one and then say submit. So getting some responses in now. That's fantastic. Mostly shelter at the moment, although there's a bit of general program. Oh, this is great. Shelters is coming out in front again. Excellent. Okay. We've got about 48 people on the call and only 34 responses. So if we could just get the others just to submit a response if that's okay. So it looks like we've got quite a lot of shelter and settlements practitioners, quite a few cash and markets and general program management. So that's really good for us to understand. We might just move on to the next question. So the next question is around how familiar you are with market-based programming. So some of the options here are market-based programming is totally new. You have some limited knowledge but have not implemented. You've got good knowledge but and have implemented market-based programming. And then I just can't see the last one. Oh, good knowledge, and then there's other. And if you tick other, I might ask you to write your response in the chat. If we could get everyone to respond to that as well. Okay, so just checking that everyone can actually see also the results on their screens, so we can be following along these poll results at the same time. I know I can see them, but I'm not sure everyone else can see them. At the moment, it looks, oh, great. At the moment, it looks like, yes, people have limited knowledge and have not implemented MBP is the most. So we've got about almost 40% there. And then we've got 30% who have not have good knowledge but have not implemented MBP. And then there's some that have good knowledge and but have implemented MBP. We've got a few people saying other. So is there anyone that wants to put their response around other for this? So any of those things that is not captured there, feel free to put it in the chat. So we've got 36 responses and we've got about 60 people online. So I'll give it just a few more seconds just to capture some of these responses. And if anyone's having trouble with the poll or they don't know how to answer them, please just pop it in the chat and we can help you out there. But hopefully you should be able to just click on one of the options and then submit vote. Any issues? Okay. All right, we will move on to the last one anyway. So can you tell us, for the last poll, why you were interested in joining the session today? So the options within this are to learn more about the MBP and shelter guidance note. Second one is to hear practical examples of MBP. Third, to ask questions on MBP. Fourth, to have a basic understanding of what MBP is and how it can be used in shelter. And then there's also an option to say other. So we'd really appreciate your responses to this one as well. And again, please let us know if you're unable to complete the poll, or feel free to write your answer within the chat. Excellent. Okay, so most people are here to hear about the guidance note, which is great because that's what we're about to kick off. And a lot of people also here to have a basic understanding of what MBP is, and hopefully we'll be able to do that as well, to be able to share that as part of this overview. So thank you for the responses to this poll. That's actually really helpful for us, and it'll help us to kind of think about things going forward as well in terms of who's interested in this. But for the minute, I would like to hand over to Chris Pacey, and I hope that yes, I think we're done with the polls. And yes, I'll hand over to Chris to give a bit more background and overview of the guidance note.
Great, thanks very much, Leanne. Just trying to turn on my camera with a limited success so far. Okay, there we go. I think we're on. So hi, so my name is Chris Pacey. I am the Global Cash and Markets Assessment Specialist with Reach HQ, as well as a member of the Advisory Committee for the Markets and Crises Community of Practice. And together with my colleague Jenny Weatherall from CRS, we're just going to give you a quick overview of the concepts in this guide and some of the ways that it can apply to humanitarian and development programming. But first, I just want to say a few words on why we felt this guidance was needed. Can you go to the next? Thanks. So markets play a critical role in almost every aspect of a household's efforts to meet its basic needs in a crisis. And this is especially true in shelter. In fact, the process of building and maintaining or renting adequate shelter is one of the largest financial burdens that most households will ever face. There are a number of resources that are out there that are presenting the market-based framework in general, a market-based programming framework, and we'll go through that in a few minutes. But to date, there's been no sectoral or thematic guidance on how to apply these principles to shelter specifically. Meanwhile, on the shelter side, there's been a fair amount of documentation on CBA for shelter programming, with cash and voucher assistance being considered a subset of market-based programming. But there hasn't been as much on the ways that shelter actors can work with a more diverse set of market actors in order to create systemic change. And so with those gaps in mind, both the Global Shelter Cluster and MIC saw an opportunity to work together to create the guidance that we're presenting today. Can you go next? So the market-based programming and shelter guide is designed as a sort of introductory overview to the intersection between these two fields. It's a sort of a first step to define the key concepts within this intersection and create a foundation for the approach. It's geared in part towards shelter practitioners who are interested in exploring ways to create change within and through shelter market systems. But equally, it's geared towards MBP and CBA practitioners who are interested in better understanding the complexity of shelter programming and how their work can fit into the sector. You can see the general contents of the guidance up on the screen, which match the topics that we'll be talking about in this webinar. One thing this document isn't, it is not meant as a comprehensive guide on all aspects of assessment or program design or implementation. That could possibly come later if an extension of this work is something that practitioners are interested in seeing. And next slide. So before we jump into the market-based programming framework, I first want to present just a number of key definitions just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. So first of all, starting with the umbrella term market. So we define a market as a system in which buyers and sellers come together to exchange goods or services. We use the word system because this doesn't necessarily need to refer to a specific place. You can talk about things like the global wheat market, for example, and use that as your unit of analysis. A marketplace, meanwhile, is a physical space or a virtual platform where people buy and sell a variety of goods. Sorry, I think I went on mute for a second. So I want to clarify this phrase virtual platforms, because often people think of these as sort of larger websites like Amazon or Alibaba, or things that are mainly used in highly developed countries, but they can equally well refer to small businesses or micro enterprises that sell their products on Facebook or WhatsApp or over the phone, and these can be very, very relevant to the humanitarian context in which we work. Now, this distinction between markets and marketplaces is crucial to make because often we stop at just assessing a local marketplace in our areas of intervention, and we sort of assume that we know all that we need to know for a successful market-based programming. But in truth, more has to be done if we want to truly understand how the market as a whole works. Now, market actors that's any individual or enterprise involved in buying and selling in a market system. And this can include anyone along the supply chain, anyone from the original producers of raw materials to processors, to wholesalers, to retailers, and finally to the end customers themselves. They are also considered market actors who can have an influence on the overall market system. And then finally, a market system. So we define this as a network of actors involved in the sale and purchase of a specific good or service, along with the services, infrastructure, policies, rules, and norms that shape their business environment. Now, this is a complex one, and I think probably the best way to explain it is to just go straight to the next slide and start explaining the market-based programming framework. So on the right hand of the slide, you can see a graphical representation of the market-based programming framework. We'll go through that bit by bit in a second. But in general, market-based programming covers all types of programs that engage with market systems in any way. which includes programs that work by using existing markets as they are, by supporting them to strengthen them and improve their functionality, by which I mean their ability to provide crisis-affected households with everything they need to meet their basic needs. And finally, creating broader market system change by working to shift livelihoods or shift the goods that are bought and sold so that they better meet the population's needs. Now, I've mentioned cash and voucher assistance a few times. So cash and voucher assistance is a type of MBP. It's usually a way of using existing markets to deliver aid. But it's far from being the only type of MBP, and I hope that that is a key message that we're able to share throughout this webinar. So in essence, market-based programming tries to facilitate a crisis-affected population's economic recovery and create lasting impact without undermining existing economic activities and relationships. Now, there will always be a place for in-kind aid under certain circumstances. There will always be a place for that sort of life-saving aid. But that said, there have been situations where we, as humanitarian actors, have effectively destroyed a country's.
Chris, you've muted yourself again, yeah.
Sorry, it's actually not me doing it. I'm not sure who it is, but so there have been situations where, as humanitarian actors, we've had strong negative effects on countries' market systems and created aid dependencies where they didn't exist before by incautiously providing in-kind aid when we shouldn't have. So everything that we do should, at a minimum, be market aware. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so the market-based programming framework is pretty dense with information. So let's try to break it down a bit. So can you click once? Thanks. So people in crisis are always at the center. And this is not just a gimmick. It's something that's really useful to keep in mind, because when you start talking about supporting market actors, this shouldn't be about just supporting businesses as an end in itself. We always need to keep the end goal in mind, which is the vulnerable people that we are trying to help. Can you click once? Let's look next at access and availability. So when we talk about access on the right side, we're generally looking at interventions on the demand side among customers to either shift demand or to reduce any physical, financial, and social barriers that might exist to accessing the goods and services that people need. Now, with availability, we're talking about working on the supply side to address shortages and blockages and bottlenecks that prevent supply chains from functioning as efficiently as possible. And again, both of these can be done by using markets as they are, by supporting markets to strengthen them, or by creating broader market system change. Now, the arrows help to reinforce that each of these different levels of market-based programming can be used at different points of the program cycle. So ideally, there should be a trajectory leading out of acute emergency relief towards longer-term economic recovery programs as the situation stabilizes. And also MBP can be used to achieve goals spanning from preparedness to resilience. Can you click once? Now we can talk about services and infrastructure. So these types of interventions deal with critical systems, services, and facilities that market actors need to use in order to conduct their business. These are things like roads and port facilities, warehouses, financial services, and even simply information about market conditions. If that information isn't flowing properly, that can also be a possible target for market-based programming. And once more. So finally, let's look at reform of market policies, norms, and rules. This concerns the enabling environment in which market actors operate. Things like taxation, business regulations, land tenure, access to finance, or even corruption would fall under this. So interventions in this sphere can be complex and challenging, but they can also be extremely impactful, because there are some cases where aid actors have the opportunity to use their influence and to use their market power to advocate for simple changes to regulations or procedures that can make a major difference to crisis-affected populations. So I think I will leave it there and hand over to Jenny. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. as part of the guidance note, now to just dive a little bit more into some of the shelter specifics of the guidance note after that overview of what market-based programming kind of is from Chris. There's a number of different priority markets and market systems that are relevant to humanitarian shelter and settlement responses, and that play a really critical role in the ability of affected populations to have access to safe and adequate housing and shelter. And you'll see on the slide here some of the kind of market systems that the guidance note highlights that are usually particularly important for our work. So these include, firstly, markets that affected populations use to meet their shelter needs. You know, they might hire local labourers for shelter repair or reconstruction. They might rent properties in the private rental market. And secondly, it also includes markets that humanitarian actors ourselves might interact with for our response. So, you know, we might hire local contractors to build shelters or housing. We might purchase construction materials for distribution to households. So in the guidance note, we tried to kind of bucket and categorise some of these relevant markets for shelter around these 6 areas. So we've got commodities and materials, labour, housing and land, financial services, legal services and utilities. And each of these have their own unique sort of set of market actors that are involved and different policies, rules and norms that govern how these market systems function and work. So it's really important to understand how these different markets work when we're planning our response. So as Chris mentioned at the start, and as we all know, the process of building, purchasing, renting or maintaining an adequate shelter is one of the greatest financial burdens faced by households, irrespective of country or context. And nearly every aspect of this process interacts with market systems in some way, whether these are housing and rental markets, markets for essential household items like NFIs, heating fuel, weatherproofing materials, markets for tools and construction materials, or markets for, construction labour or other basic services. And market-based programming is a powerful tool for collaborating with and supporting these local markets and the actors within them to ensure that they in turn are able to support households in need to access the goods and services that they need. And humanitarian actors risk undermining existing market systems and livelihoods related to these if our programmes bypass or replace them rather than working with them, as Chris mentioned earlier. And so just to kind of share a little bit about some of the things that market-based programming can and can't do in relation to shelter. So on one side, market-based programming and shelter responses offers a lot of kind of opportunities. So it can be quicker, more efficient. It uses pre-existing networks and supply chains to save lives and address shelter needs. It can also allow more dignity for communities, giving more choice and freedom and the opportunity for people to make decisions that directly impact their own housing and living conditions. It can also support local economic recovery, so helping existing shelter vendors to continue to operate or even become more resilient in the face of future shocks. And it can also promote do no harm approaches, so avoiding inadvertently undermining existing market dynamics and processes that could hinder, local recovery from crises. It can also promote localization, so strengthening the role of local market actors in recovery and reducing the role of external actors in direct service provision. And as Chris mentioned, market-based programming can be used in emergency response to meet short-term shelter accommodation needs, while it can also provide transitional and longer-term housing solutions as well. However, we should be mindful of what market-based programming doesn't do, and it doesn't avoid or reduce the need to adhere to shelter support best practices. It doesn't negate the need to provide technical assistance or pay attention to achievement of quality standards. So we still need to be mindful of our minimum quality standards, and it's just one approach in our sort of toolbox to address shelter needs that may not always be the best option or the most appropriate. So depending on the situation, market-based programming approaches such as CVA or cash and voucher assistance can be a strong alternative to in-kind distributions of shelter materials or NFI interventions or kind of direct build approaches. particularly where local market systems and supply chains remain reasonably intact and markets are generally functional. Also where clear bottlenecks in supply chains can be identified so that that can inform how we can intervene to improve functionality in the market system. And also when there's an opportunity to transition to strengthening market systems to ideally minimize the need for direct distributions or support in future. And a well-designed market-based programming intervention can have multiplier effects throughout the target market system that so not only just meeting the shelter needs of direct aid recipients. So this can include creating income generating opportunities, local enterprises that are linked to shelter supply chains or local production of materials, helping protect or preserve livelihoods, so keeping vendors in business and people in work, improving local infrastructure and access to goods and services for a wider population in the area, aside from the obvious benefits of helping to meet communities' basic shelter needs. And so, as Chris mentioned, we have different types of market-based programming that can be used at different points in the program cycle or in our response phases. And so you'll see in the guidance note a table that just indicates where different market systems and ways of or types of market-based programming can be used at different stages of the program cycle. So for example, during preparedness, we might work across using supporting and developing markets, whereas in response, we're likely to focus more on using markets, providing cash for people to buy shelter materials locally, for example, or agencies hiring local contractors, or supporting markets in the emergency phase. So we might train labourers in improved construction practices, or we might provide grants to CGI sheet vendors to restock or repair their warehouses. And just a key note to remember is that for market-based programming to be designed effectively and for us at minimum to not do harm to markets, market assessment and analysis is really critical. And that's irrespective of the stage of the response or the type of shelter response or crisis that we're intervening in. We should really be making an effort to understand the market system for the most relevant goods and services for our target population's shelter needs. So although the guidance note doesn't go into the detail about how to conduct market assessments, it does link to some resources on how to do this as well. But this is a really critical point that's highlighted in the note. And then just a last note before we dive into some of the case studies of examples of market-based programming and shelter. Given that, as we've noted, almost every aspect of shelter and settlements assistance will interact with market systems in some way, it's important that we understand these systems to make better decisions about what forms or combinations of assistance will best meet people's needs. However, we know that shelter and, for example, rental housing markets are notably complex and can become even more so during emergencies. So many shelter and housing related markets are poorly regulated. They can be highly politicized. They're often subject to overlapping layers of regulation, including those that surround housing, land and property rights, construction standards, environmental regulations. And markets for labour and materials can show huge seasonal and cyclical variations that can impact, the viability and also impact self-recovery. So, for example, construction markets are often referred to as boom or bust markets, meaning that demand often rises but rarely is sustained, resulting in eventual market crashes. And these cycles can often be exacerbated by humanitarian programs and can be magnified if we're looking at kind of small rural markets as well. And that can have consequences for the incremental nature of self-recovery and self-building that we often see among households. And finally, some of these shelter-related markets can be both formal and informal, and not necessarily well regulated. So we do, as humanitarian actors, need to kind of figure out how we can navigate and learn to work within both types of market systems. So it's important to be aware of and understand some of these complexities and to be able to identify risks and what we might be able to put in place to mitigate some of those risks. And so the guidance note also outlines 3 kind of buckets of complexity that link to a lot of shelter markets. So the first is environmental issues. So risks related to negative environmental impacts are common. For example, the use of extractive materials such as uncontrolled sand mining or timber harvesting that can lead to habitat loss, erosion. Some markets can also put pressure on natural resources and can lead to shortages of these resources and increase hostility among communities. This is something we saw in Cox's Bazar related to kind of widespread deforestation. The second bucket of complexity is kind of protection issues. So not everyone has equal access to some of the shelter-related markets, particularly people with disabilities, older people. Refugees might face discrimination, for example, in accessing rental markets. There's also a high risk with poor construction quality, which can put people's lives, at direct risk. So the stakes are quite high when it comes to shelter, particularly when we look at material quality and construction practices. And finally, some shelter and housing markets can involve kind of high risk or illegal activities, the use of child labour, exploitation, wage discrimination, poor working conditions. So we need to be really mindful as well at analysing some of these markets and looking to engage with them about some of these protection issues too. And then finally, there can be political and social issues. So market actors can take advantage of disaster events by engaging in price gouging or collusion. Shelter markets are vulnerable to being politicised, having discriminatory policies or local norms. We talked about, refugee access to rental markets. That's one good example. Or there might be restrictions on the import or use of certain construction materials. And there's also significant potential for corruption and illegal trade in many shelter markets as well. So that's an overview of some of the guidance note. And just to note that the guidance also includes a couple of sections with some more examples of shelter market-based programming, as well as links to some key resources. So I would encourage you to look at that as well. So that's the kind of theory and conceptual part over, and now we'll hear from a few presenters on different examples of market-based programming. So I'll hand over to Marta first for our first case study.
Hello, good afternoon, evening, morning to all. Thank you so much for the invitation. I will be talking about, let's say, a pilot that we've done for the Latin American and the Caribbean context through a task force. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm here in the name of the task force, and I think it's important to mention everyone that was there. This was a group that was formed by UNHCR, IFRC, IOM, REACH, NRC, and supported by CASCAP, and with the collaboration of the response to the Venezuela situation interagency platform, specifically the shelter sector where I'm working and that I'm representing here. So why this group was formed and why we decide to work on a rental housing market handbook? This, let's say, was born through a series of CASES and shelter webinars that were done through the CAS working group and the shelter sector within the coordination of this interagency platform that coordinated response to the Venezuela situation. And one of the things that came at the end of these webinars was the gap on the information about rental assistance programs and how to design it and how to give a better response. And that's how in October 2021, like a year ago, we decided to move forward and start this amazing exercise, mainly led by Jimena Peroni, which I think is also on the call, from CASCAP, seconded to IFRC. So please, next one. So why specifically we need it? So in terms of what we are seeing in LAC, in Latin America and the Caribbean, is that this is a mixed response where we have, let's say, different shelter solutions, but specifically the rental shelter solutions are are kind of the main one in urban context. So we have disaster response, which of course, as you all may know, have more an emergency character. But then we have this mixed refugee and migration flow that are now moving to from the emergency to a more transitional approach, which need durable solutions. And that's where the rental programming needs to be much more informed, let's say, than the emergency one, where we felt that our...
Oh, you've muted yourself, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So that's in this, let's say, situation, we felt that we really need to have a better informed response, and we were missing key information. So I will give you the example of the response to the Venezuela situation where I'm working. It's easier for me, but I think it will give you an overview of what is going on. So we have more than 15 countries implementing rental assistance programs, and on the joint needs assessment that we have for our humanitarian response plans for next year, we have identified that there is someone muted all the microphones. Apologies. So we have identified that the main group is refugees and migrants in destination in urban areas, that they are looking for these kind of solutions. Even governments are moving to public policies and public programs to support them through this kind of shelter solution. Then also we have identified that the rent payments are the main household expenses, and we know that, for example, in Costa Rica is 46% of the expenditures. In Peru is around 76%, and also we've seen that families are getting into a huge indebtedness due to the payment of the rent. And as a consequence of it, we have started seeing forced evictions, and always in urban context. So the number of people living in the streets or having to spend one night in the street due to this situation is rising in the past years, and mainly also due to the COVID situation and the financial crisis that the region is going on. So this is, let's say, one side of what we are seeing, and then we are seeing at the same time that the quality of the shelters and, well, say, the houses they are renting is quite low. So the spaces are overcrowded, the living conditions are are really bad. So if we put everything together, we felt that we didn't have at the time enough information, and we still have gaps, of course, but we could do more if we really understood what was going on in the specific neighborhoods, because the data that we have goes through the whole, let's say, the whole country or the whole town, but we don't have the specific of a neighborhood. We don't have the specifics of the details. And it was also mentioned before, but one of the challenges that we had is also the discrimination, and this is one of the risks that this, let's say, market systems is facing. That is, in our case, the insecurity of tenure, but also the discrimination. So sometimes refugees and migrants don't have access to the houses that they could pay, or houses that are on good conditions, because of this situation of xenophobia that they are living, or because, let's say, nationals are going first in the queue of going to rent. So we did the exercise through this, let's say, collaborative group, this task force, from the regional level, but also we put it also at national levels with the pilots in Colombia and Ecuador. So we first went through let's say, desk review through all the organizations, the information that was available. We drafted a first handbook, and then the most important part, and I think that's the critical part, is that we decided to pilot it in 2 countries. Colombia and Ecuador, and then from everything that we learned there, from the exercise, we were able to modify that handbook, to adapt it to the context, to see what were the challenges, and then became with the final version, which is, let's say, the first final version, because we believe that through the pilots in the future, we will be able to redraft it, to continue working on it. So it's an alive document. Please, can we move to the next one? So why we decided, I more or less explain it. Also, I would like to highlight that we are used to do market assessments on household items from the shelter sector. And this was some kind of also one of the gaps, to have the knowledge on how we could do an analysis of houses and rental houses specifically, which was one of the challenges. The field handbook is thought also for shelter, but also CBA or CBI practitioners of any kind at any level, and it's also thought to be done on a collaborative work. Then the main objective is to inform and have a quality response, and the good thing is that even if we did it for luck, let's say, most of the tools and most of the items that you will find there are really able to be contextualized and adaptable to different contexts. So not only urban context in luck, you can take it and adapt it to yours. There is a QR there, you can scan it, and then you will get to the version of the manual. It's in English and in Spanish, and all the tools, I think by exception of one of the shelter tools, are in both languages. We are still working on one of the, on that one that is missing. Please, can we move to the next slide? So how do we build this? I won't go into the details of the full manual because I don't think we have time or is the space for it, but I will go through the, let's say, main idea of what it is and how it works. So we work through two frameworks. One is the market-based programming that was already explained, so I'm not going to enter on that part. But then we also work on the framework of what it means access to adequate housing. So this was already developed by Human Habitat and OHCHR in 2010, and we have adapted to the context. We have adapted to and also updated to the situation, and through the analysis of these two frameworks and working through them, like going really deep into what it means and how it affects to our context, we have defined, and please next slide. So we have defined the analytical dimensions where these two conceptual frameworks match. And we have decided that we need to work on these 9 areas specifically. So we have the stakeholders and market mapping, we have market practices, security of tenure, type of housing and standards, supply demands and price changes, affordability, policy and regulatory environment, services, infrastructures, and risk. And based on these 9 let's say dimensions, we have developed all the tools and all the materials that we need. Please, next one. Yeah, thank you. So at the end, the field handbook is, let's say, the guideline, the steps that you need to follow, how we can work on it. But then at the same time, we have developed the full toolbox. And then here you will find tools that will help on the methodology and how to plan an assessment. Then we will get all the tools that you have to implement to collect data. You don't need to implement all of the tools. So it depends on your context. If you have done your secondary data review and then you find that on one of the sections you have more than enough information, you don't need to use that tools. But we have developed all of them, all the ones that we thought were important. So you can choose, and based on your context, you can really implement it and collect the data that you need. There are tools that are based on AAP approaches, on how we can listen better the community, how we can understand neighborhoods. That's, for example, the tool number 7. We have other tools that are more specifically on how do we interview a tenant and what are the main questions that we have to do, and then how do we analyze all of that information, how do we provide the feedback. The report are the last 2 tools, and let's say that from the shelter perspective, I'm quite proud of the 13th, which is also connected to the tool number 5. The tool number 13 tried to analyze the whole information has been collected on the house per se on how it works, how is the relation with the tenants, what is security of tenure, availability of services, etc. Is more that access to adequate housing approach. And then we have tried to find the main indicators, the main questions, and how we can, let's say, score it and identify if a house is adequate or not to live there, and based also on the situation of the market. And well, just to finalize, it has been there has been many challenges on how we were able to develop this. One is like we were mixing people from CBA and shelter, and we have really different concepts, and our way of seeing the response and the way that we implement our projects it's quite different. So understanding, for example, the market-based program is by shelter people was a challenge, and also the other way. The other thing is it was a collaborative and spontaneous exercise, so we didn't have dedicated funding, and that came at the end as one of the challenges. The other one, and we felt this was more at the field level when we were piloting, is qualitative versus quantitative. It's much more easier to do the analysis and collect data when we were doing quantitative tools, but then the qualitative, it's time consuming, it's more specialized, but at the end the information we get was critical to understand the market. So we need both to be there, and we need to understand that we cannot just collect, and I will go on the easy way, numbers. We need to collect also a lot of qualitative data. The other one is that because this was a collaborative exercise between a lot of organizations in different areas in the region, we never worked face-to-face apart from the pilots, but the full team never met in person, and that was one of the challenges we will have appreciated, to have at least a few days of workshop in person. And the last one is the inclusion of differential approaches. This was quite a challenge because it has to be cross-cutting, and let's say CBA were going on their part, shelter was going on their part, and at the end to put, let's say, AAP, protection, etc. as a cross-cutting thing in all the tools, in all the field handbook was quite a challenge. And I will leave it here. First, I will say I'm really sorry because I cannot stay until the end of the session. So if there is any question, anything, you can please write on the chat. But I believe my colleague Jimena that is here, she can answer the questions on the chat about this. But also, thank you so much for the space to all.
Thank you so much, Marta. I think it's really useful for us to understand the process that you've gone through, and congratulations to everyone involved. I think it's a wonderful resource. We have shared the links in the chat and people have seen that, and yeah, we'll pass on any questions from that, and Jimena will be here, as you said. People have been putting their questions in the chat, which we would love you to keep doing. We'll come back until the end of the presentations to address all of them. But now I'd like to move on. We have Aprilyn Villamar from CRS, who's going to be talking us through a cash for shelter program that was implemented in the Philippines. April, are you there?
Hi, good evening. Good evening, Marshall.
Hello. Yep.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening from the Philippines. It's evening now here in the Philippines, but I'm happy to share with you. I'm April. I'm part of CRS emergency response team, and I am pleased to share with you the project Daijok. Daijok means helping each other, or the volunteerism among the community and the neighborhood. So that's the title of the project. And the project is a post-earthquake shelter recovery through cash transfer after a magnitude 7.2 earthquake in Bohol, a province in the Philippines. So that's what's on October 15, 2013. This is one of the cash transfer project of CRS Philippines. The project was implemented by CRS, also by national and local partners from Caritas Philippines and Diocese of Tagbilaran, Bohol. The project supported 873 households. The cash delivery is through partnership with First Consolidated Bank, a bank that started operation in Bohol, in the province. Yeah, like what I said, the project is the first CRS emergency response for shelter construction through cash assistance, combined with shelter technical support. The learning from this project became one of the basis of the succeeding cash for shelter project by CRS Philippines, and it was also shared with different organizations. So the project was funded by Australian Aid or AusAid. Next slides, please. So yeah, so partnerships, setting beneficiary criteria and protection mainstreaming are some of the contributed to the success of the project. But I would like to focus my sharing on implementation principles and strategies specific for cash transfer that contributed in achieving the goal of project. The project aimed to help the families build quickly and also to strengthen the local economy and support the market. One of the implementing process was to have conditional cash transfer. Cash transfer was divided into 2 tranches. Can you click the next one, please? So yeah, this is the process of the tranches or the conditionalities. For tranche 1, the conditionality is that household representative was required to attend orientation on recommended disaster resilient shelter design. Also, the engineers provided BOQ or the bill of quantity and labor cost for. There are 2 types of shelter, the 18 square meter and the 24 square meters, because the average household member in the Philippines is 5, so, or in the province it's 6, and also for 7 and above, that's 24 square meters. So yeah, so it's also consideration with the living space of shelter minimum, of SPEAR minimum standards. The household needed also to prepare salvage and salvage materials, lumber materials, and clear their area as conditions before they receive the first tranche. Project took advantage also of the spirit or culture of volunteerism among the community. But if payment was needed for lumber and clearing of the area, it was settled to the vendor or laborer after the first tranche. Because in the Philippines, we usually pay the laborer or the carpenters 1 week after the work for construction. Then household will receive their first tranche of cash assistance. So yeah, like what I said, the transfer value were also based on household member size. So we have 2 different amounts depending on household's member size. For tranche 2 conditionality, household were required to construct their foundation and also the shelter frame. So after they received, for this project, we need to remember that cash assistance do not ensure high quality construction. Implementation of technical assistance and on-site monitoring along cash support was the key in the project implementation. That is why the program provided technical assistance not only before they received the cash assistance for the first tranche, but also during the construction until after receiving the second tranche. This is to ensure the beneficiary constructed SPEAR compliant shelter design that would be resilient to multiple disasters like the earthquake, the typhoon, and landslides. Households and carpenters were guided. The carpenters that were hired by the recipients or the beneficiaries were guided by the engineers and foremen. They used shelter carpentry techniques appropriate to the Philippines. We have what we call Build Back Safer or the BBS, if you're familiar with that. So the engineers or foreman go around the community. They go around the community to physically check the shelter construction progress and give technical support. They also encourage the recipients to go to work together to complete their house, because this happened right after big major typhoon in the Philippines. If you are familiar with Typhoon Haiyan, so labor was really in competition during that time between different areas. So yeah, so that's also one of the tasks of the technical team. And also, for my opinion, it is also important to have engineers that have experience working in the community in terms of cash for shelter. For cash for shelter, you don't have a direct contract or with the laborers or the carpenters. No, it's the household that will do the construction. They will manage it, and the engineers needs to know that it's not the pace of our direct build construction. There are different issues if the household are leading the construction. Another strategy is to maximize the ICT for e-solution. In data collection, our meal use iForm and iPads for monitoring progress. This also is important based on the experience to establish feedback mechanism and have project team members who are visible or visibly monitoring the project areas. Since we don't have direct hired carpenters accountable to use to do the construction and report to us the progress, unlike in direct build. So this our feedback mechanism become channels of communications. Also, the people or the meal team going around the community to check the progress they become the communication between the project implementers and the community for suggestions, complaints, and inquiries. And also for the community to feel that we don't just give cash then go. They still feel that it is easy to it's easy to connect with the project team or with the implementers, and somehow to say we are just there guiding and watching them. So at the end of the project, 873 households were built in 63 different villages. Next slide, please. So why we come up with cash for shelter, or why cash? The decision was based on different assessments. So CRS conducted in-depth shelter assessment, computing the BOQ or the bill of quantities, and also the labor cost needed, and also market assessment was conducted, and it was found out that markets are operational despite of the earthquake, and also financial service provider assessment was conducted, and we identified one financial service provider. It was the First Consolidated Bank. It's not widely known in all throughout the country, but it is the most accessible bank in the community since it's originated in the province. Then we also take into consideration the advantages of cash assistance in the community. Jenny mentioned several during the early presentation, but yeah, I just want to quickly mention some. For the project, so market-based programs in shelter response can promote empowerment and allow more dignity for the community, because we're giving them choice, we're giving them freedom. It can develop strong sense of ownership, their shelter. Also, as you can see, choosing the materials, you can see it's the photos are small, but you can see that households use different materials for their walls, for their doors, and also the placement of their windows. So it's really giving them choice, giving them freedom, and also giving them pride that they build their own house. Also promotes a culture of volunteerism, and it's here in the Philippines, the dole out project are somehow seen negatively somehow in it's because you're just giving small amount, and they are just receiving and not doing anything for them. But also household, another one is household data. This is one also important result of the project is household adapted improved shelter techniques, because they are the one doing their shelter assistance. Based on the post-distribution monitoring, majority of respondents reported that they were not aware of earthquake-resistant construction techniques before the earthquake, and they learned about them through assistance provided by CRS. And almost 98% of the household repaired or built their homes using techniques provided by the project engineers or the information, education, and communication materials. And others are, of course, other benefits.
Sorry, April, I'm sorry to ask this, but would you mind just wrapping up if you can quickly?
Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
Another advantages were it strengthened the local economy and like what I said, this is one of the first shelter cash assistance that was implemented by CRS. So it really built our capacity in doing cash for shelter. So yeah, that's all. Those are the numbers were the result of post-distribution monitoring, the satisfaction, and the feeling of safety in the households or within the shelter. And next slides, please. So yeah, these are the challenges we had during the implementation. But yeah, I just want to highlight some. So the misuse of cash. So it was done it was prevented, or the recommendations to implement conditionality and tranches. I think in general, one of the major challenge also is, even in other projects, it's difficult it's slow to implement a project or cash specific. The challenge in opening bank accounts, also the construction of shelter by the households, they are really slow in the beginning. But once the financial service provider, the bank adjusted, it went faster afterwards. And also the construction, having model or pilot of shelter construction is really helpful, because we are giving for the household, the amount was small, so they think it's not enough for them to build their shelter. So we hired carpenters from previous projects, direct build projects, to start few houses in the community in the different villages. So they just copied it. And I think I want to highlight that for the quality and SPEAR compliance, yeah, like I said, cash grant alone do not ensure high quality. We need to marry cash CVA or cash transfer with technical support. Shelter, it's one of the shelter SPEAR minimum standards, having technical assistance, and marrying cash transfer with technical assistance is really important in this kind of, or in this context of support or response. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, April. Really appreciate it. And I think just in the interest of time, we'll move straight into Sheldon. Sheldon, and I'm sorry to have to ask this, but I hope that you can be concise, because we do want to get to a little bit of time with questions at the end. So Sheldon is the Associate Director for Applied Innovation in Habitat for Humanity's Terwilliger Centre for Innovation in Shelter. And he's got some really interesting things around the Credit Plus approaches that Habitat for Humanity has been exploring over the years. So over to you, Sheldon.
Thank you, and I will try to be concise. Yeah, so if you could go to the next slide. So Habitat for Humanity, we have a relative long history of exploring credit plus approaches. Credit plus combines housing credit with additional services that can facilitate access, for example, to advice, materials, and reduce costs, with the end goal of increasing the quality of home construction. It's important to note that our explorations were primarily in the context of longer-term development programs, not necessarily humanitarian response, but many of our findings, I think, are broadly applicable. We've also in the past referred to this as housing support services. So when you do peruse our resources and see that term, you can substitute credit plus. So there's three big buckets of approaches that we've explored over the years. Again, we talk about it in different ways, but broadly, the first one is market linkages. These are strategies that engage and connect other market actors, such as hardware chains, with low-income borrowers. It also includes what I'm going to call more consumer education strategies. So it could be firms developing simple informational brochures or campaigns for low-income borrowers to increase their knowledge on construction. The second category is loan preparation. So this is often handled by the loan officers of the financial institution, other times by other staff at the FI that results from training provided to them. They then provide low-touch services like estimating home improvement project costs. They can also provide basic project planning services, so helping the borrower identify and break up their home construction project into steps or stages, and helping them prioritize it. And then the third bucket is construction technical assistance, and these are high-touch advisory services usually provided by engineers and architects that are intended to support the borrowers in designing, planning, and completing their construction project. And these categories are also on a spectrum from low touch to high touch in terms of the resources and time devoted to each by the development actor and the financial institution, with market linkages usually being the lowest touch approach. So going on to the next slide, I just want to quickly share an example of that third bucket, construction technical assistance in Tajikistan, actually. So our national office there collaborated with Iman, which at the time was the largest MFI in the country. They had an existing housing microfinance product, and given that research was showing that over 70% of housing in the country was substandard, we wanted to try a credit plus approach that bundled the credit that they had with high touch construction technical assistance. So we embedded engineers in the MFI branches and provided needs assessment, budgeting, procurement, and supervision services to all the borrowers who had a home improvement loan that was more than $1,000. And the initial product offering ran for at least a year, perhaps longer. I'm not sure how long exactly. The technical assistance was subsidized by Habitat and Iman, and we intended to explore more sustainable models for scale up, including a fee-based service as time went on. So going on to slide 3, or the next slide. So evaluation showed that the resulting construction was indeed high quality. So the construction technical assistance was accomplishing its goal. And Iman did find that client retention rates were very high for these borrowers, as they opted to come back to Iman for future home improvement loans. We also found that these technical assistance services were highly valued by communities where the home improvements were predominantly overseen by women, who were being asked to oversee the construction process, while the men were off in Russia during the construction season. So there's a lot of kind of migration to provide temporary labor in Russia during the spring and summer when a lot of these home improvements were done. So the issue, though, was in trying to transition this from a free service or a subsidized service to a fee-based service, with the borrowers paying for some or all of the services. We found that the services themselves were probably not differentiated enough, so allowing for really highly tailored services, or allowed clients to select one type of service but forego the rest. Ultimately, the model was discontinued because it wasn't sustainable without either us or Imon subsidizing it. So the next slide. So as I mentioned, we've explored multiple variations on this type of credit plus model and others over the years. And I just wanted to share a few lessons that we've learned related to kind of each bucket that I mentioned earlier. So with market linkages, it's a real challenge to have a financial institution manage an alliance with market actors who it doesn't normally interact with in the course of its business, so its financial business. So it's really important that whatever alliance is put together generates clear benefits for all the parties, getting the incentives right. Something we often talk about in market-based programming, and it's really important here. And it's often better to not link it to specific loan products, instead have it as part of a broader developing market strategy. Similarly, efforts to inform and educate base of the pyramid markets using things like Build Back Better guides or campaigns can achieve broader impact if these incorporate mass media communication strategies and multiple actors. So, could be local MFI networks or hardware stores, media production companies. We've actually explored these as strategies in great detail. I'm thinking in particular of in the Philippines. I think some of my colleagues are on the call right now, with and without financial institutions, and we've seen success here. But again, mostly unlinked from specific financial products. So in loan preparation strategies, the high level of adoption and incorporation of these strategies into financial institution operations for us have really signaled the importance of continuing to extend the training and supportive tools to financial institutions that are implementing these products. So these generally work well. The focus should be on offering training to staff at the financial institutions to ensure these remain in-house. We haven't found outsourced estimation services, for example, to work well. So if you can offer training and ensure that it's kind of incorporated in-house as part of loan officers' duties, that often works best. I'd say this is a good using market strategy, using the language of the market-based programming framework, though it can be a long-term intervention. These can be sustainable in the sense that financial institutions will continue to offer them. And then the third bucket, construction technical assistance strategies. Offering this kind of technical assistance to borrowers can potentially improve, or can potentially work to improve construction quality. I want to emphasize the potential aspect, as a lot of its effectiveness is contingent on what's being offered and how the services are offered. And if it's done well, households do value it, but you need to go in understanding that this will be a time-bound offer that ceases once funding ceases. So this is very much a using market strategy in that sense. And the next slide. I just want to share a few more learnings. Having loan officers provide non-financial services in general is not viable. So again, limiting services that loan officers provide to more basic things such as budgeting advice and brochures, that's something that is either directly related to their job or it's just, it's simple for them to do. The high-touch services should be provided by third-party market actors, which is a viable alternative we've explored in certain contexts, but mostly not linked to any specific financial institution. And that's more of a developing market strategy. Alliances between financial institutions and other construction-related firms usually don't work. I think I mentioned that earlier, unless they are self-driven and managed. You know, we may have great ideas on the ideal partnerships as development actors, but if our experience is anything to go on, what works on paper almost never translates into reality. But if you find an alliance emerging organically, that's fantastic. See if there are things you can do to strengthen and support that alliance. We have done that in a few locations. I'm thinking of a great example in Peru, which I would share if there were more time, but happy to do so offline. And finally, because I know the construction technical assistance is probably of most interest to this crowd, the issue here is that these services are unlikely to ever be something that financial institution clients will fully pay for. So as Habitat for Humanity, we have mostly ceased providing these services ourselves as part of a larger housing finance program. So just remember, you know, as humanitarian actors, a reliable source of external subsidy will always need to be identified, and expectations should not be communicated that this can never be financially sustainable, at least by the financial institution. As I mentioned, you know, there's often options that are unlinked from the financial institutions that can be explored. And I believe we'll share resources that go into a lot of these topics in more depth following the webinar. So thanks for listening. Hopefully there's enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, no, we definitely will be sharing all of these resources. So thank you very much, Sheldon, for that. So my name's Corrie. I'm on the Markets and Crisis Advisory Committee. I work for CRS, and I'm not a shelter person, but it's great to see so many questions already. And obviously we are quite short on time, so we're going to try and get through some of the most pressing ones. And then if we have any time, you can raise your hand as well. Just to flag that one of the reasons we invited those 3 case studies is because we felt both in the MIC but also in the shelter community of practice that a lot of the conversation around shelter and market-based programming focused on cash. So it's great to have Sheldon and also to have Marta present non-cash sort of programming, because we really want people to start thinking outside of the box. So thank you very much to all of the presenters. And maybe Sheldon, if you wouldn't mind, because there's a question which potentially you might be able to answer. I can see there's a question that's, well, about if the guidance presents information on how to reform market policies, norms and rules, which lead more to kind of market system change. And that's from Fatwa. And I feel like Habitat for Humanity might have an idea if there were kind of guidance or things you'd kind of talk about, but just to note, the guidance note is quite concise and we haven't covered that specifically, but I wonder, Sheldon, if you have an idea if there's anything out there that you'd recommend in that regard.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that in general, the enabling environment issues are often one of the most tricky ones to tackle in market-based programming. There is some guidance and case studies related to this. I'm thinking all in the context of, you know, longer-term development programming, not necessarily in humanitarian response. But if you go to beamexchange.com, that has a whole wealth of information. And if you type in enabling environment, I think you'll find a lot of resources there. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I've just popped the link in the chat as well. But one, yeah, and just to flag, there are a few questions about what the guidance does and does not include. We would encourage people to have a look at it, but we were limited in our time and resources for this. So it's a guidance note, it's introductory. And there's a couple of questions here from Ed. I might take the first one, which is around accurately measuring the indirect impact of market-based programming on crisis-affected people. So Chris obviously presented that we have kind of people at the center of market-based programming. But how do we measure impact? I don't know, Chris, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think indirect assessment is something that's always a bit difficult to achieve, much more difficult than direct observation. But I guess in general, if you're trying to assess these sort of indirect impacts of market-based programming, it's usually best to link it to the intended outcomes and the intended impacts. So kind of looking at it before and after a sort of baseline and end line, as there should be with the evaluation of most programs. So just kind of trying to understand how a household's consumption patterns have evolved over time, their expenditure amounts, and also their expenditure patterns over time. And also the same for other measures of household humanitarian impacts, like at the end of the day, after the end of this program and after some time has passed, do we see that a household's housing situation has actually improved from beginning to end? Has the condition of their shelter improved as a result of either the CBA that's been provided to buy certain materials or technical assistance in improving the shelters? So things like that, those are the sorts of issues that I would focus on. And then I think the other half of that is just assessing the markets themselves to understand the changes that they have undergone. So changes to the availability of key items, lowering barriers of access, and so on. So yeah, that's how I would approach the issue.
Well, thanks, Chris. At the very beginning, Rafik asked a question about how we'll kind of, I guess, roll out this guidance note in different countries and contexts. And are we planning to collect any lessons about how it's used? That is a good question. I feel like because the two sort of bodies, the shelter community of practice and the markets in crisis, we don't implement ourselves, so it's a little bit tricky. We're very reliant on the partner agencies that kind of are involved in both of these and also who have joined this webinar. So we don't particularly have much power to do that. Having said that, I don't know, Leanne, if there's been any discussion at the Global Shelter Cluster about shelter clusters, maybe sharing this, and if there's any plan there that you could share.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, I mean, our intention is that we would like to be sharing it with our clusters in different countries. We just haven't got to that stage of dissemination yet, but really good to see that there's interest in it, and we would like to follow it up so that we can continue to have these conversations. Absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. And I think just to say, if someone here is working in a context and you're involved in the shelter cluster and you find this interesting, do reach out to your shelter cluster coordinator and ask them, to share this. I'm sure some of us on this call would be more than happy to share some materials for that as well. So then we have a few additional questions in the chat. I'm wondering which ones to take. There's a lot of back and forth about the use of cash, and I know that that's kind of a hot topic. Everyone has opinions about cash programming. So maybe just I can see that there's been some conversation about maybe using conditional cash rather than multi-purpose cash for shelter. Just to flag, in the guidance note, there is a section which looks at kind of shelter specific issues with market-based programming, and that does tackle some of this. But I think, Jimena, I don't know if you're online, do you want to come in on this and just discuss a little bit about the MEB and how kind of shelter is kind of incorporated?
Sure. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you well. Go ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, so I think that the debate was on how to incorporate in the MEB. And I think that one of the big questions that we started when we were talking about rental programming at the beginning was also to what extent did we have to start with that discussion, or should we step back and try to analyze the market and the need assessments with a much more holistic way of seeing things without jumping ahead on thinking already in the cash assistance discussion. So So I think that that would be my main messaging, that whether we think that it's conditional or not conditional, whether we think that we should include, in this case, the rental component on an MBP or not, that I can definitely share more about how to do it. But I think that I always try to work with the group, with the task force, or with the cash working group, or with the shelter working group or cluster, is try to step back, try to see market as a whole, try to see if before analyzing if it should be part of the transfer value or not, we should be analyzing if it's maybe much more worth it to invest that money in a more sustainable way of seeing things, regulatory framework, advocacy, or maybe in the supply side, or maybe in the demand side, or maybe just putting money in the service side of the, I don't know, a legal service that can improve the way people contract with the landlord. So that would be my main. I know I'm not addressing directly the recommendation as such, but it's a lot of back and forth in that discussion that we can definitely go into. But I think it's going back and seeing market as a whole and see to what extent the linkages with affordability from an adequate housing point of view can be much more strengthened, instead of going directly to the discussion on transfer value and cash from the moment zero. That would be my takeaway of that back and forth, if it's worth it.
Thanks, Ximena. So I'm just gonna, I can see Sarah has a question here, which I think is directed at April Lynn, and I think I'm going to pop the link in the chat, because I think this is what you're referring to, Sarah, which is a CRS piece of research on the positive impact of vendors of a market-based programme. So April Lynn, I don't know if you have a sense, but for the Philippines 2013 response, was there any positive impact on those construction material vendors, and was kind of the market system strengthened? Do you have any idea about that?
There was no learning event conducted, but yeah, in general, in the Philippines, the vendors can easily increase their supply, unless they are in a small island. Yeah, but also the cash transfer indirect benefits is for the small vendors. Those who were also affected by the disaster, they have small capitals that they are using. So if we go to the direct distribution or voucher with the big vendors, the income will go to the big vendors. But yeah, the cash for shelter supported. I think we're able to support the smallest vendor.
Cool, thank you. And just a flag, I can pop the link in the chat as well, but market support programming, which is kind of mentioned in this, there was a really good guidance from CALP about market support programming, and it's increasingly funded by donors. So yeah, we can encourage you to check that out as well. Right, we have 2 minutes to go. So I think we're going to hand over to Leanne to wrap it up. But thank you so much for all your questions and engagement.
Thanks so much, Corey, and thanks to everyone, as Corey has said, for your questions and engagement. I know there's a few other questions there, and there's probably still some that you've got. So when we follow up with the resource materials from this session, please feel free to respond to us and ask more questions that you've got. We'd love to hear from you. And in terms of helping to continue that discussion, please consider joining us in either the Shelter Cash and Markets Community of Practice or in the Markets in Crisis discussion group. So we've got both of those links there, and I think will be shared within the chat, so they're a bit easier to click on those links directly as well. But otherwise, basically, we just want to thank you all for your time today, and hopefully we will be in touch with you in the coming months, and as we continue to sort of share about this guidance. And we'll also be looking to understand from you about what kinds of things that you'd like to see us developing together in the future. And so please continue to share those things with us, and hope to be in touch. Yes, the presentation will be shared and the recording will be shared after this. As I said, please feel free to then respond to us and we can get in touch and continue that discussion, but please consider signing up. So thanks everyone for your time and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Hey, shall I end the meeting, Lian? Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.